In the demos that I've shown you so far, I had to comment out this line, person.h, and I'll show you why by taking away the commenting out and building. See all these errors? Person, class type redefinition. See declaration of person. What? What happens is I explain to the compiler what a person is by including person.h. And then I include tweeter.h. And if I just go there, you'll see that the first thing that tweeter.h does is include person.h. And the preprocessor pastes that same include file in again and then says, what? Person again? Well, that's an error. Our person's already been defined. We can't have two classes called person in the same namespace, and you get an error. So because we were really focusing in that demo on the mechanics of inheritance, I didn't want to get into that. We just commented the line out. But obviously we have to sort of fix something about that. Now the old-fashioned way would be to have someone include both files, get an error, and then say, oh, I get it. Tweeter brings in person, so I don't need to bring in person, so I'll just take this line away. I don't like that. I don't like you having to build a tree in your head of all the possible things that have been included by other things. You just sort of should be able to say what you use and let them work it out amongst themselves. And there are a variety of ways to do it. Here is a way that many, many developers use. You go into the header file, and we're going to add directives in here that basically prevent it from ever being included twice. So if someone tries to include person.h a second time, the header file itself will recognize that it's already been included and not define the class again, and therefore not trigger the error messages. And we're going to do this using some preprocessor directives that can define arbitrary constants. People use this to say, for example, define pi to be 3.1415, etc. And then they can use pi in their calculations. We're going to define some constants that really just indicate we must have been this way before because this constant is already defined. Once you've defined a constant, you can test to see if it's defined or not, and that's how we'll know what's going on. So the constant, by tradition, is based on the name of the file. That way they won't conflict or clash with each other. So, for example, I might define underscore person underscore h, and that's a variable that represents the name of this file, person.h. If that's already defined, we must have already included this file. If it isn't defined yet, we haven't yet included this file. So before I define it, I test. If not defined person h, and then I'm going to put the end of that all the way down here. So what's happening is, if person.h is not yet defined, great, in comes the whole rest of the file. We define person h, we declare the person class, and everything is as before. But if person.h is being included for a second time, when the preprocessor is doing that including and it reaches this if not defined, it says, oh, but it is defined. Okay, we'll skip down here to the end if, and as a result, person does not get included again. So let's build this. And you can see there's no error messages. This works perfectly. The main file, classes and objects, can now include person and tweeter without worrying that they have some kind of relationship or that one includes the other or that it matters what order. It all just kind of works the way that it should. And this pattern is called an include guard. Whatever your arguments for or against include guards are, please don't let compiler performance be one of them. This is a relatively high-performing way to solve this particular problem. But it's not the only way. There is another way that isn't standard. So this is standard. It'll work in every C++ compiler in the universe. They all understand the idea of defining a constant, and they all understand the idea of testing against the constant. And some of them, for example, Visual Studio, can also be reasonably smart about realizing, gee, the end if is at the very end of the line, so I don't even need to process the rest of the file. There is another approach that you can take, and in fact, when we added that class using the wizard, Visual Studio took this approach for us, and that's this directive here, pragma. As you can see, it's a preprocessor directive, just like include or define or if not defined. And pragma once says this particular file should only be included once in each compilation unit. It's the same thing behind the scenes. The compiler generates a unique identifier and makes sure that if it gets included again, it doesn't actually process it again. Some people find this more readable. Some people find it less readable. There may be compilers out there that don't recognize it, in which case you'd need to write the old include guard way anyway. You're welcome to use pragma once if you prefer it to include guards. You should be able to recognize include guards when you see them in someone else's header files and understand what's going on. And if you're copying someone else's code for your own purposes and you copy include guards, make sure you change the name of the define variable that you're using to guard the include with to something that represents your new file name. Otherwise, you're going to get really strange behavior where I know I'm including this file, but the compiler's acting like I'm not, because if two files actually both test the same variable, they can't both get included. That's never going to be a good thing. So you have to understand how include guards work in order to be able to understand other people's code. If you would prefer to do the pragma once and you're only going to be working in Visual Studio or Visual C++ Express, that's fine. Pragma once will work beautifully. They're both available to you.